So joining me on the Fear the Fro podcast today, alluded to him earlier, a man whose voice you know from the post-game press conferences and a guy whose content I'm sure you have seen and shared and liked, Mikey McNuggets. Thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure, Bob. Hey, I have used your infographics, particularly the salary cap sheet and future implications one, more often than I like to admit, to try and get some of the guys on UCSS to actually understand what some of these moves entail. And it's still an uphill battle I'm climbing, but seeing it in color-coded, very simple, bold graphics has made my job a lot easier. So I do owe you a giant thank you for that.
Well, I appreciate that. And I understand that's the part that I think I enjoy the most about you on the show is oftentimes I find myself saying, Mike's doing God's work here, trying to deal in all the minutia that a lot of people just want to cruise past. But it's certainly over the time that I've seen the show. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the origin of the Ultimate Cleveland Sports Show, because I don't know personally. How did that even come into being?
Yeah, so back in 2020, it would have been 2021, I was working as just a regular sports reporter down in College Station, Texas. I started my broadcast career the traditional way. I wanted to be the next Jim Donovan on Channel 3 or any, big-time broadcaster. I started in Bristol, Tennessee, then went to College Station, Texas, and worked for the company Tegna, which is now the proud owner of the Ultimate Cleveland Sports Show. And we used to have these monthly emails that they would send out for the national sports update, where everyone could hop on a Zoom. They'd share a good story or two, tell us about future initiatives. And one day, Sean Hamilton, who is still part of UCSS today, he is the executive producer of WFAA Sports in Dallas, said, yeah, in 2022, we want to launch this digital sports show. We have no idea what it is. We don't really have a plan for it, but we want to get something in the digital sports realm. As soon as he hung up the Zoom, I emailed Sean and said, I want in. I don't care what it is. I don't care where it is. I want in. Because I was seeing after time and time again, covering these A&M games, no one was waiting to 6 o'clock or 11 o'clock to see my highlights. You go on Twitter, you can see every play you want. You go back and watch the ESPN replay. I was essentially giving out all my TV highlights 6 hours before on Twitter because the engagement was awesome. So my contract with the station in Texas ended in January of 2022, and the movement on this digital show was completely stalled. And I told Sean, I was like, Sean, I'm not going to re-sign a contract because I want to do this. And he was like, it's a risk, but be patient. We'll see what pans out. I had applied to be the executive producer. I pitched an entire show that's not UCSS in the same range and got denied by that. But they hired Steve Becker to be the EP, who is currently our EP. And the day after he was hired, he gave me a call and said, Mike, I heard tremendous things about you. I heard you apply for the job of executive producer. Well, I'm the EP, but I need a senior lead producer. Wherever we take this thing, do you want to interview? Hopped on it. Interviewed, and a day later, I was employee number 2 of the project. What people don't know, it was supposed to be the Ultimate Dallas Sports Show. It only switched to the Ultimate Cleveland Sports Show when Tegna initially got sold for about 10 days. And as part of the deal, WFA in Dallas was going to shift off to another TV operating system. So then Tegna had to pivot. Where next if it's not Dallas? Cleveland's a perfect market. They called me back and said, hey, Mike, I know you accepted the job, but we're moving to Cleveland. You still want it? And I said, Cleveland, Texas. We're going to the Ultimate Cleveland, Texas. That's a two-way football town. They go, not Cleveland, Texas, Cleveland, Ohio. And I said, count me in. And about a month later, I'm in the apartment I'm in now for the first time. Fast forward 2.5, almost 3 years. And we are in the top 0.1 percentile of YouTube channels. So it's been a hell of a ride, but that's kind of how it all came together.
So are you meaning to tell me that it wasn't anchored to Cleveland? Did you have any ties to Cleveland prior to this job?
I had never been in Ohio before I visited for the first time looking for apartments after I already accepted a job to come to Cleveland.
Oh, okay. So was your upbringing Texas-based?
No, I'm from New Jersey.
Okay.
Went to college in Boston. Did a summer in LA that I hated, like I told you. In TV, if you want to get on TV, you got to go wherever the job takes you. So I started in Bristol, Tennessee / Virginia. The station was in Virginia. I lived on the Tennessee side. You ever seen that Geico commercial of the Geico? Now I'm in Virginia. Now I'm in Tennessee. Yeah. That's a real street. And half the street is Virginia. Half the street is Tennessee. Then College Station. Then what I thought was going to be to Dallas, but instead pivoted to Cleveland. And frankly speaking, Tegna could have envisioned this going any better than it has, because right after the show came to Cleveland, the Browns traded for Deshaun Watson. They traded away Baker Mayfield. And 2 months later, Donovan Mitchell was traded to the Cleveland Cavaliers. You couldn't have asked for some better topics to have a show evolve with. And here we are today.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And now, I mean, so you didn't even have hosts attached to the show when you originally took the job. You could have been saddled with just terrible people, and that would have been your lot in life.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but I'm going to do it anyway. When we were in Dallas, we did have some hosts attached. Jane Slater of NFL Network was going to be the main host of the show. DeMarcus Ware was going to be part of it. We were in talks with Jason Terry to potentially be our basketball guy. We had thought when we were going to launch this in Dallas, because so many former athletes live in Dallas, it was going to be an athlete show. Transition to Cleveland. We quickly found that very few former Cleveland athletes still live in Cleveland, and the ones that do and do media had already had deals and non-exclusive, so weren't really within our reach. So we pivoted and brought in some media people. It helped that Jay Crawford, who had already worked at Channel 3, had wanted to do some other digital sports venture with Tegna before, so then he became the first host attached. And then we ended up with Bull, Garrett, Tyvis, Jason, and Dustin Fox was supposed to be Tyvis. And then 92.3 found out we got Bull, and they said, nope, you can't have them both. We are going to completely put the kibosh on allowing you guys to have Dustin on the show. So I pivoted and got Tyvis, which ended up working out awesome because Tyvis is an incredible addition to the show. But it was a whirlwind, Bob. It has panned out, like I said, better than I think any of us could have imagined. But it certainly hasn't gone from start to finish smoothly. But that's what makes it fun. TV's not supposed to be easy, and it's not supposed to be it's not supposed to go as planned every day, and it rarely does in the UCSS world.
Yeah, no, I think that's an awesome story. And there's a lot of parallels in terms of, even with Dan Patrick, like he was coming from that ESPN world. We talked a little bit before about my relationship with them, and it was a similar, I mean, maybe didn't feel like as big of a risk because Dan was attached to it, but he essentially went from being under this giant corporate umbrella to launching his own thing, and then to carve out the space that he did. It's one of those things where I always like to see those kind of, quote unquote risks rewarded, because you could have taken the easy path. And to have developed what you guys did now, I think it's pretty amazing. We appreciate it. Speaking to that, now there's a lot of guys, I think over the last few years, one of the things I've enjoyed is that, Fedor's been on the beat forever, but there's been a lot of new voices that have kind of made their way into those press rooms. Yours, Jackson Flickinger, Spin Davies, all you guys. And I alluded to it when we were talking offline about how after the game last night against the Hornets, you had said on Twitter that you plan to put the question to Kenny. I want to play it for the audience now, for the people who didn't hear it. It kind of bounces off of Jared Allen's comments about ethical basketball, and you asked Kenny his take on it. I wanted to play that exchange.
After the Lakers win a couple days ago, Coach, Jared Allen said you guys were playing ethical basketball. I'm not sure if that's something he got from you.
Ethical?
Ethical was his I'm curious what that means, if that's something you guys talk about.
I've never heard that. I'm going to ask him what is ethical basketball. When we play the right way, maybe is that it? I'll have to. Yeah. I did think, on that road trip we played some really some beautiful basketball, and aesthetically, right? Like this team, I hear it all the time. I hear it from the fans. I read about it. People enjoy watching how we play and how we move it and how we share it. And we had some good sequences tonight in the first half. I thought so ethical. I don't know. That's a good one.
Now the question I had there, Mike, was: do you think he knew what ethical basketball meant and avoided it because it implies some are unethical?
No, because Kenny is, maybe to a detriment at sometimes, brutally honest with us. Now, he's not going to just divulge all information. And he usually says, well, I can't tell you that, but I'll give you this instead. I genuinely got the sense, and I think you could hear in his voice when he first says ethical, and he almost spit out his water if you can see the video, that he was a little taken back by that word. I think as he talked it through in his mind, he kind of maybe pieced together a little bit of what Jared Allen meant following that Lakers win. But yeah, I don't know if that's a terminology that the Cavs have ever used before. I don't think he knew. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when he asked Jarrett, hey, Jarrett, what'd you mean by ethical? And I had every intention of asking Jarrett after the game what he meant by that in the locker room. But Jarrett, as he mostly does, kind of sneaks his way out before he gets a chance to get surrounded by media and have to answer questions. So I am on the hunt to ask Jared Allen what he specifically meant by ethical basketball. But I don't think Kenny was kind of holding back with us on that. I think he was genuinely surprised that was the word choice of Jared Allen too.
Now, it seems like, I mean, you alluded to Kenny is very candid. He seems to be very positive. He has such positive engagements with all you guys. How have you found the difference this year to last year in terms of, were you this involved with the beat last year, and were the vibes the same?
I was not nearly as involved, so I can only give you a half perspective versus a full perspective. But in terms of speaking to the coaches, they had different personalities. I always say there's not a right way or a wrong way to handle the media. As someone in the media asking questions, I prefer the Kenny Atkinson approach because he's just more open. He'll give you more. He feels more engaged when you're asking questions. JB, even if they had won by 50, had the exact same tone and demeanor as if they had lost by 50. So he just wasn't going to give you a lot. There's not a right or wrong way. Bill Belichick in the NFL won 1 million Super Bowls without ever giving an answer to anyone. And guys like Adam Gase, who had the taco crazy eyes in his first press conference, didn't win anything. So, you could look at it both ways. Andy Reid has won a ton, and he's pretty open with the media. So the vibes are different, but I also think that plays in the fact they're 31-4. And it's really, really hard to have a bad vibe when you're on pace for one of the greatest regular seasons in the history of the NBA. I will tell you, though, in the locker room, they feel way more relaxed, way more open. I've said this on UCSS. I'll say it here. I've been in enough locker rooms to know when something's legit and or being manufactured. The chemistry between these guys is 1,000,000%, and you cannot convince me otherwise, legitimate. And there's not a stat that characterizes or quantifies chemistry. But the way that Donovan and Darius and Evan and Tristan and George and Ty Jerome and LeVert all interact with each other while someone else is being interviewed is unlike anything I've ever seen in a professional locker room. And I'm telling you, it doesn't equate to an extra 3 points in offensive rating. It doesn't make their net rating better. But there's going to be a time in crunch situation where they're going to make some sort of little play, whether it's a guy making an extra slide into help position to take a charge or making the extra pass for a dagger 3, where we could look back and say, you don't do that unless you love your teammates and you play like you're playing as a family. And this Cavs team right now is as tight as any family I've ever been around.
Well, I think that's the thing that I find the most amazing is you allude to it in the post-game press conferences and or even in the just locker room availability. And Spin has been posting some amazing compilation videos where you see, I mean, every interview feels like a group interview because you hear guys chiming in. You had Darius the other night talking about that back and forth with LaMelo against the Hornets, and Tristan shouting in the background, and you can hear Donovan and all these other guys talking about kind of the one-on-one component of it. And even in the aftermath of the game where, DG kind of hijacks the post-game interview with Jared Allen and you get the Frohio reference, it really feels like not only do you see it in the locker room, but then these passes in these situations, these, swing situations. Like Donovan had one the other night where he hurled it across court to Nyang in the corner and then swung it back to Max. And Max is kind of just getting into the fold now. But to see these type of plays developing where it's almost like guys just innately know where everyone's going to be beforehand, I don't think we felt that as much last year. And whether it's the chemistry is just immensely improved, it's definitely resulted in an impact on the court. And I wanted to speak to you a little bit about that in terms of, obviously, you can't say enough about the performance, the record-setting, start to the season, the 15-game win streak, this 10-game win streak we're on now, heading into this matchup with Oklahoma City, where I think a lot of people look at this as, okay, this will be a true test for all the people who are hesitant to label the Cavaliers as contenders. I think we can all agree that if we come out of Wednesday with a victory, even the most ardent, don't get too high too soon people will start to embrace this squad in a way that they haven't. Do you have expectations going into Wednesday night?
Yeah, this is the two best teams in basketball by any metric you want to quantify as. And sure, the Celtics are probably still the betting favorites to be the NBA champions this year, but this is the best team in the East with the best offense in basketball, who is undefeated against Western Conference opponents, against the best team in the West with the best defense in basketball, who is undefeated against Eastern Conference opponents this year. I saw on ESPN yesterday, this is just the third time in the history of the league. The NBA is old. Bob, you and I combined probably aren't as old as the NBA. I don't know how old you are, but I'm just going to assume the NBA is older than us because I don't think we're going to be over 75 years old together. This is the third time in the history of the league that two teams have started a season with 30 wins in the first 35 games. Just third time ever. This is the second highest combined winning percentage in a game or between two teams in a singular game in the history of the league. You have to go back to the Warriors' record-setting season when they played the Kings, who were 38-6 at that point, for a better win percentage cumulatively between two teams. My expectation is that we're going to get an incredible basketball game. They're both rested, so we're not going to get the rest excuse. They're both relatively healthy. Yeah, Chet Holmgren's out. I understand it's a big loss for Oklahoma City, but they're on a 15-game win streak without Chet Holmgren. So let's not pretend that they are severely handicapped and not at full strength, even though they could be even better down the road. And it's a team that I think matches up really well against each other. It's a clash of styles, but in a good way, because they both want to drive and kick. Oklahoma City from a defensive standpoint, and I was doing a little video breakdown for UCSS tomorrow. I think they're going to start Jalen Williams on Evan Mobley and try and force the Cavs to feed Mobley in the post. And last year I would have been like, I don't know how great I feel about that. But after what Mobley's shown us the last 2 weeks, I kind of love that matchup, even though Jalen Williams is the second toughest defender to shoot over. His expected field goal percentage as compared to the reality versus the expected, it's -11. The only one better in the league than him this year has been Wemby. He's a percentage point better than Evan Mobley, and we all know how great Mobley is. There are so many different aspects of this game to break down, Bob, that you could pick and choose any of them and spend 20 minutes talking about that specific angle. And then I'll counter and be like, yeah, that's cool, but what about this? And I think that's what makes this matchup on Wednesday so exciting. It's also Donovan versus SGA, the two best shooting guards in the NBA this year. And sure, SGA might be a point guard, whatever, but that ball dominant position, where do you want to start? Like we could go anywhere. This is what the NBA needs in January. I guess my last point is, everyone always says, well, the NBA would crap itself if we had an OKC Cleveland finals, two small markets. Who gives a rat's you know what? It's the two best teams in basketball, and they're both incredibly fun to watch. Sure, it may not be major markets, but I don't remember an NBA rule being that a major market has to win the NBA championship every year. So I'm just ready. Like, if we could super sim the next 38 hours till tip-off, I'd be all in favor of it.
I'm with you. I'm super excited for all the reasons you laid out. Just the idea of getting to test this offense against the very best in the league when it comes to defensive matchups. And I know what you said about the Chet thing, but it's wild to see how productive they've been even in his absence. So I think there's situations where they may have leaned to that matchup, even with Chet healthy. We still would have seen a substantial amount of Hartenstein and Williams out there in the big rotation. And speaking to that, that's one of the things that I was doing some data stuff on and looking at the net rating pairings for power forwards and centers, because one of my campaigns for the longest time has been essentially the value of Jared Allen and Evan Mobley as a front court. And my belief that all the stuff that we've heard in the past about, they're fit and stuff, not only has it been dispelled in terms of on-court product this year, but I think seeing the evolution in Evan, it's something that now we're seeing productive lineups when they're together, when they're apart, in both iterations, different pairings of the guards with the bigs. All that's kind of been turned on ahead to the point where, in the absence of Max, we had bench units that were super productive on both ends of the floor, both metrics, offensive and defensive, that involve guys like Karis LeVert and Yang and Merrill, guys not typically known as defenders. Max has come back, plugged in a lot of those same situations that Sam's in. And those same bench units are just pummeling second shift teams, blowing open leads where we're seeing on a regular basis these 15, 20-point leads. And I think to some degree, people need this test to be able to validate the Cavs in the eyes of, the national landscape. But I'm curious where you sit, because as we get closer to All-Star break and these conversations swell up about All-Star candidacy, I was listening to the Hoop Collective this morning, and I took issue, with something, unsurprisingly, but it's
the best rivalry in sports, Bob.
It's totally one-sided. He doesn't know I exist, and I just keep swinging away. So as it relates, though, to the Cavs specifically, a year ago, we're having conversations. A year ago on this date, the Celtics are a little worse than we are, 28-7, and they're being talked about as if they have 3 shoe-in all-stars, and Derek White is all of a sudden the flavor of the moment in terms of this guy should be the all-star. This year, I'm listening to Tim try to tell me that it's not a lock the Cavs will even get a second All-Star. So my first question would be, where do you come down on who you feel is a lock as an All-Star for the Cavaliers? And then if you're making a decision between an Evan and a Darius, where do you fall on that?
So it's funny you asked that question, Bob, because I've actually had a change of heart in the last 12 hours on this exact topic. Donovan Mitchell is a lock as a starter. He will be a starter. One, guaranteed, done. In my opinion, Evan Mobley should be a lock. Not even a conversation. He should be a lock. So that's two. I had said, we did this topic on UCSS last week, and I had said, when you look at the guards in the Eastern Conference, there are a lot of guards in worthy conversation to be one of the all-star reserves, and there's no set amount of guards versus forwards, whoever the coaching staff has to take. So you can decide you want to take an extra guard, or you can decide you want to take an extra big, whatever. I was like, when you look at some of these guys, it might be tough for Darius to find his way in just because of the numbers. He is 100% unquestionably having an all-star caliber season and is playing like an all-star. But it's a numbers game. Someone's going to get snubbed that you can make a case for. And up until yesterday, I was like, you know what? I just think Darius is going to be on the outside looking in. But I have flipped my tune. And I'm actually willing to, right here on the Fear the Throw pod at 4:27 on Monday, January 6th, plant my flag in the I will riot if Darius Garland isn't an all-star case. And here's why, Bob. Yes, his numbers may not be in the same ilk as a LaMelo Ball or a Tyler Hero right now, who have higher scoring averages and their overall regular box score numbers are a bit higher. And you could do the per 36, which I like, but I think some people are so married to per 36 that they miss the actual context of it. The reality of the situation is the Cavs are beating the absolute brakes off everyone they play. Darius is doing what he needs to do on a nightly basis to put the Cavs in a position to win. And yes, the All-Star game is not meant to just recognize the best players on the best teams. It is meant to recognize the best players in that conference each year. But Darius has been one of the best players on the unquestionably best team in the Eastern Conference. And what separates him from some of the other guys and what has made me completely flip my script on this is when he's matched up against those other guys in the same conversation he's in, Bob, Darius has outshined them all. Last night, LaMelo Ball, and I understand he's a fan vote favorite. He's not the coach's choice favorite. And
I don't think he's any coach's choice favorite.
Yeah. So I understand that, but he's one of those guys in the conversation. You can't watch that game yesterday and tell me LaMelo Ball should be an all-star and Darius Garland shouldn't. When he's played the Pistons earlier this year, and I think Cade Cunningham has a tremendous case to be an all-star. We're going to talk about the 2021 redraft in a sec. Cade Cunningham is playing out of his mind. It's a sub-500 basketball team, and I know he's asked to do more than Darius Garland, but Darius Garland is on a 31-4 team. That's a conversation I'm willing to have. Tyler Hero, no, I'm sorry. He's having a great season. He has turned into the number one scoring option on Miami, but their number one scoring option is only averaging 4 more points than the Cavs' number 2 or 3 on any given night. I'm just not willing to hear it anymore, and I do think regular season success and teams' success should have the tiebreaker advantage. And I didn't necessarily believe that a second ago or a day ago. And now, like I said, I'm firmly planting my flag on Darius better be an all-star. 4, I think, is pushing it. But yeah. 3, I would be very disappointed if the Cavs keep up this current pace, if they have 40-something wins at the break, and Darius, Evan, and Donovan aren't all represented in San Francisco.
I pretty much align with you. I spared you from my rant because I didn't want to drag you into my Bontemps feud. So some of these.
I'll do it. No. Listen, we got all day.
I'll summarize. I kind of align with what you were saying initially, where I think Evan has the clear path. I think I look at the front court and the guys that are leading the vote, I would probably put all of them in front of Evan in terms of Giannis, Tatum, and Kat. But after that, outside of Jaylen Brown, I don't know who you look at in the front court and say Evan's not a better player or at least having a better season than those guys. So while you pointed out there is no rules as far as the breakup, you don't have to have 6 guards and 6 front court players. I think in all likelihood it will shift more to the back court because there's just more worthy candidates there.
And Bob, sorry to cut you off, but just so everyone knows, the guys ahead of him in the fan vote right now, Giannis, Tatum, Towns, they're in. No argument.
I not only in the
whole first half of the season.
Yeah, and those are all worthy cases. Even Towns, for the criticisms that, because I know he's not a Jackson Flickinger favorite. We talk about this offline a little bit, where admittedly, defensively, he's got his limitations, but his numbers are fantastic. And the Knicks and the Celtics are fantastic teams. They should enjoy the same privilege we do in terms of being represented. So I'm kind of happy they also happen to be leading the fan vote, because in my mind, that just makes it easier to stomach that I won't have to worry about a LaMelo Ball snake in a spot where then you're looking at your backup guards, your Jalen Brunson, Damian Lillard, Trae Young, Cade, all those guys. I do think it'll be a tougher path for Darius in that regard. I think there are a couple things, though, that I'm optimistic about. One, I do think that there's a serious debate when it comes to, okay, who's more important, Evan or Darius? And the fact that I don't think it's a clear option A, clear option B, clear option C on the Cavs. I think you can debate the impact of any of those top three guys on this season. So if Evan Mobley gets in, which I fully expect him to, I think it will be a lot harder to look at his running mate, whose counting numbers may be a little bit better in Darius Garland. And obviously we know his impact transcends just the counting numbers. But I do think that he's got a good shot. I think it may be difficult with the guards because of what you alluded to. A lot of times it feels like if you're a middling team and you have some guys putting up numbers, they do want to get some representation. But the other thing that I would say is, as always, there's going to be injury replacements. Yeah. Something will happen. Last year, you saw Trae and Scotty get in as injury replacements. I think even if Darius doesn't get in that first group picked by the coaches, which again, this is the other thing I said. Just think about what we heard on that West Coast road trip from Mike Malone, from Steve Kerr. I'm supposed to be convinced that the coaches don't see what's happening here after listening to stuff like that. And because you could be a curmudgeon, just end your press availability and, exit stage right. But these guys have gone out of their way to compliment how ridiculous this team has been this year. So I don't believe there'd be four. Even as big of a Jared Allen fan as I am, to me, it's the Derek White thing all over again. It's getting greedy. It's like he's great. We know his impact on winning. We know it transcends the box score, but the numbers just aren't going to be enough. And there's not room on a 12-man roster for four guys from one team. I think two is an absolute lock. I don't think anybody should be discussing this. Like, if you want to pick Evan, you want to pick Darius, fine. But I don't even like indulging in conversations where people talk about it like we're going to be a one all-star team that's on pace for 70 goddamn wins. It's just not going to happen.
No, when you look at the guards, like I said, I'm just going off the fan vote that was released last week. So LaMelo's first, Donovan's second, Lillard's third, Brunson's fourth, Trae's fifth, Cunningham's sixth, Maxey's seventh, Jordan Poole's eighth, Tyler Hero's ninth, Derek White's 10th. I don't think Jordan Poole has any chance to make the all-star team, so you could cross him out. The other 9 guards all have at least some sort of case to be made if you really wanted to make a case that they could be all-stars. LaMelo Ball, probably the weakest, even though he leads it, but he is averaging 31, 7, and 7. And if you were blind and just did the blind resume test, you'd be like, oh, wow, how's that guy not an all-star? Yeah. But the reality is winning basketball is more important than box score stats. And at the end of the day, what Darius is doing on the court is leading to a historic pace for this Cleveland Cavaliers team. And I do hope, and I am hopeful, that the coaches who are making these decisions will take that into account. And I always think, like you said, there might be an injury, 2 injuries. You see the replacements every year. I think at the end of the day, Darius will make it to San Francisco as a third guy, whether it's on the first 12 they pick or as an injury replacement. But regardless, whether he makes it or not, there is no debate. And I want to make this abundantly clear. Darius is playing like an all-star this season and is having a season that is worthy of being an Eastern Conference representative.
I totally agree. Now, I want to, because I could drag this out forever, but I think a lot of the conversation is kind of going to overlap with what we're doing next, which is with this discussion about Evan Mobley and his kind of rise this year and the leap that he's made. It got me thinking about the 2021 NBA draft, because certainly that was a draft that was loaded with talented players, many of whom we've alluded to here in terms of this conversation, Cade Cunningham being one of the more prominent ones. So what I wanted to do was revisit that draft now with the benefit of hindsight, and just as a thought exercise to see, okay, how would we do things differently? Who would we draft where? How do we rank the prospects in that class? So just to set this up for the audience, the first thing I would say is it doesn't matter who drafted where. We're not considering the teams that drafted in those slots, Detroit, the Rockets, Mobley. This is simply basically an exercise based on Who do we think has the most upside? Who is the player we would most want to build a franchise around? I think a good way to look at this before we get into the specifics, because I want to build to the point where we do the reveals to some extent. I wanted to start by discussing tiers.
Okay.
Now, just to go over the draft order, I mean, most of you guys who are listening to this podcast remember it, but to remind you, this is the first several picks. It went Cade Cunningham, Jalen Green to the Rockets. We took Mobley. The Raptors took Scotty Barnes, Jalen Suggs to the Magic, who later also drafted Franz Wagner. Josh Giddey went to Oklahoma City. Kuminga went to the Warriors, as well as Moody a little bit later in that draft. Now, picks 9 to 13 were kind of a wasteland in this draft. It was Davion Mitchell, who's now in Toronto, Zaire Williams, who's now in Brooklyn, Bouknight out of the league, Primo out of the league, Duarte, I believe he's in Chicago, but he's not playing. Then you get some steals later on. Picks 14 and on. Moody, Kispert, Alperen Şengün at number 16 to Houston, certainly one of the prominent names. Trey Murphy III, who's in New Orleans, suffering through just a terrible season for that team. Trey Mann in Charlotte, we did not see him, but he's been very good in the minutes he's played this year, just hasn't played a lot of games, only 22 games this season. Jalen Johnson, another name, late in that first round, the 20th pick to the Atlanta Hawks, certainly a player who's been very good. And the other guys I think are worth mentioning here, Cam Thomas, a late first-round pick in Brooklyn, Santi Aldama with the Grizzlies. He was the last pick of the first round. Some notable second-round picks. Herb Jones was a second-round pick. Yep. Our own JT Thor, a second-round pick. Ayo Dosunmu, he was a second-round pick. And a couple of names as undrafted guys in Sam Hauser and Jose Alvarado who have carved out roles for themselves. So there's other names in there, but that kind of gives you a lay of the land in terms of the notable ones. Now, I wanted to ask you on tiers.
Okay.
Are there a group of guys? I think we all have mostly the same names near the top. I view it as, okay, looking at this draft, is there anybody in your eyes who you say, this is a guy who can be the best player on a competitive team, and I would build a team around this person and their talents? Who falls into that group for you?
I have two guys that fit that category.
Okay.
We're going to go names. We want to go names now. We just want to leave the numbers and then reveal the names as we get to
it. Okay, we'll reveal the names in a bit. I'll say I put 4 guys in that first tier. And I think that's a little bit generous. But I had trouble here kind of separating what I would call, I think the toughest part for me was separating what I would call tier 2, which to me were guys that are very good, but may not be able to be the best player on a team, but could potentially be the second best player, all-star viability potentially, but not necessarily the guy who's going to be the focal point of a competitive team. That for me was tier 2. So my tier 1, I had 4 guys I put in it. My tier 2, I had 5 guys I put in that group. I'm curious where you fall. If it sounds like you're a little more rigorous, you're a little more stringent on falling that tier 1. So I imagine your tier 2 might be a little larger.
So the way I had 2 guys who I think are franchise changers.
Okay.
And that was my level of tier 1. A guy that's a legitimate franchise changer that I now believe could be a centerpiece of a championship team. In my tier 2, I had now my tier 2 and tier 3. If you wanted to combine into one big tier, I wouldn't hold it against anybody. But I had tier 2 as these guys are legitimate all-star caliber players. I'm not sure they could be the number 1, but they could legitimately be number 2s. And then my tier 3 is they have tier 2 potential, but I'm just not sure they're there yet. So I had 4 guys in my tier 2, and then I had 4 more guys in my tier 3. So I had 10 guys in my top 3 tiers. It just, the line of delineation of how you got to tier 2 or tier 3, we could go back and forth on a couple of times. And then my next tier was solid role guys I would want on my team. Was essentially how I separated my top 4 tiers.
I feel like I'm probably going to prove to be a little more generous than you. I had 15 guys in my top 3 tiers, but let's start at the top.
Okay.
You said you had 2 guys in your top tier. I said I had 4. So I'm going to guess who your 2 guys are, and you tell me if I'm right or wrong. I'm going to guess Cade Cunningham was one of them.
Correct.
And because this is a Cavalier podcast, I'm going to guess Evan Mobley is the second one.
That is correct.
Okay, both those guys are in my tier 1.
I would hope so. If you had 4 and they weren't my 2,
exactly. So I think we both agree. I think Cade has shown this season that you put talent alongside of him and you're going to get much better results. And even if his counting numbers slight uptick. I know his profile has remained largely the same, but he's taking more 3-pointers this year. He's making more. The team performance is much better. And another reason why I think he's unquestionably a tier 1 guy is because he has unusual size in an atypical position. And I think in a lot of ways, that's the same type of stuff that would make Evan Mobley a lock for me. Is yes, he's a big man, but he possesses skills which aren't conventionally big man skills. That also was the reason why I think Şengün deserves to be in that first year. And I'll say this. I'm not a fan favorite of Şengün. I feel like for too long, you alluded to the per 36. One of my biggest reasons why I don't weaponize per 36 when it comes to these all-star debates is because I absolutely loathed it when Evan Mobley was a rookie and I had to hear about how Alperen Şengün was better than him because per minute he was some sort of monster despite playing a much more reduced role his rookie year. I think it's one of those things where people use per 36 when ultimately it's just predicted stats. That's not actually what happened on the basketball court. I think per 36 is an excellent way to measure efficiency per minute or production per minute on the court. But when we extrapolate it, I just don't think it's a fair thing to do. So I don't want to do it on behalf of Darius. I think Darius's numbers stand on their own, even at lesser minutes, because we haven't had to overburden him. And I think that's a credit to the quality of the team and his leadership within it. So, but back to this, 2021 draft class, I think one of the things I've really liked about Şengün, especially this season, is I think conventionally over the first few years of his career, the conversation was, okay, this is a man with a lot of the Sabonis style skills, but maybe the same Sabonis style shortcomings. You don't necessarily trust him defensively. And what we've seen the Rockets do, and this isn't necessarily a testament to massive leaps on his end, but I think we can parallel the experience to what we've seen with Garland, is that his skills in some capacities are so good that when you put defensive players alongside of him, now you've got a Houston team that's 3rd overall in defense, that's 1st in rebounding, and he looks serviceable. In fact, he's part of some of the more successful lineup pairings in the league in terms of defensive metrics, which is something that I always feel like was the fallback of tearing him down in the past. So we know what he can do from, a touch and footwork standpoint. We know how physically strong and capable he is on the glass. He's definitely a capable passer. I do think Evan Mobley's a little more fluid. I like his ability to drive a bit more because I think it comes more from a place of athleticism than just bull rush ability. But I do think Alperen Şengün, despite the downtick in counting stats, I think it's the same argument that we make for Darius Garland, where it's served the betterment of the team and we've put more talent around him. And for that reason, I do think that he's in that first tier for me. And then I'll just give you the 4th guy and let you respond to both, which is Franz Wagner. Franz Wagner, if you'd asked me this same question at the end of the playoffs last year, I might not be there. But after the Olympics and after especially seeing what he did in the absence of Paolo, there's a part of me that feels like, you know what? He started that series against us great. I think he possesses two-way potential that a lot of the guys on this list below him do not. And I think he showed what he was capable of doing in Paolo's absence in a way where I didn't think it was a meaningless sample. I realized it got cut short by his injury. But to me, I think those 4 guys, I could look at all of them and say, okay, even without Paolo, Orlando was still winning basketball games. I think he's capable of being a very impactful two-way player. And I get that the criticism, which I think is valid, is on the reliability of an outside shot. But I'm hesitant to just dismiss him forever because the same thing happened to our own guy in Evan Mobley. So for me to write him off now on the outside shot alone, when he's shown the type of impact he can have on winning, I don't think it would be fair necessarily.
So it's funny you mentioned those 2. Those are the top 2 guys in my tier 2. So we had the same 4 guys. It's just a matter of where we decided to draw the line. And you mentioned the 3-point shot, and this may not be fair, and I could be proven wrong in the long term, and I will certainly flip my position. But the reason I had both Franz, who I had 3, and Şengün, who I had 4, on the overall list here in that second tier was I don't love their outside shot yet. And I think in today's day and age, if you are going to be a 1, you have to either have that incredibly special something else, the unquantifiable. It's Mobley's defense in this case, because he certainly doesn't have the most consistent 3-point shot yet. It's coming, and I do feel pretty good about where he's headed in that category. You have to have that something else that is truly, truly, truly elite. And Şengün, maybe his passing is there. and I just haven't fully seen enough to believe it. I know the numbers are incredible. The Rockets this season, my best bet preseason was the Rockets over win total, which I just felt it didn't look right, and I think they may surpass it by like the week after the All-Star break. So that's going to end up being a nice win for me. Knock on wood that something doesn't terrible happen. But Sengun, I just pulled up his numbers just to confirm. He's still only shooting 1.5 threes per game at a 20% clip. That's not part of his game whatsoever. I'm sure it will become more part of his game as he continues to develop. And like I said, that's just we're arguing the minutia here. If someone really wanted to make the case, and Bobby did a great job of making him a tier 1, I just see him on a slightly lower level with a slightly lower ceiling than I see Cunningham and Mobley, which is why I had them at the top of tier 2. Same with Franz. If Franz is your 2, and that's what scares me about Orlando, they are a monster defensively. And with their size and length across the board, I know they're dealing with so many different injuries. Paolo, Franz, Suggs got hurt the other day. I mean, Goga Batadze is playing awesome in some backup minutes now because they're just so depleted up front. If Franz is your 2, you could be a really, really good basketball team. If he's at your 1, I just want to see it a little longer before I put him up there. And you could argue, well, we haven't seen Mobley as a 1, and that's totally valid. And maybe it's biased because I watch Mobley every night, and my girlfriend got mad at me because I said him blocking a shot and going coast to coast for a left-handed dunk was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, and not and whatever. So maybe it's the bias coming out of me that I'm giving Mobley the benefit of the doubt on some things I may not be giving those two. But I just see Mobley's ceiling being a smidge higher than those two, and until my opinion on that changes, I have them at the top of tier 2 as opposed to in tier 1 with Cade and Mobley. But okay, we're picking hairs here.
Yeah, exactly. Well, since we have the same 4 guys clumped at the top, the next logical question is, what would be your ordering in a redraft?
I would go in that order: Cunningham, Mobley, Franz, Sengun.
Okay, see, we're basically the same. I'd put Sengun over Franz, though, personally.
Like I said, so you're going to see as we go through this, I am differential to big wings.
Okay.
That is
something that as a Cavs fan, we would lust over. It's locked.
Yeah. And I'm curious to see who you have 5 in. I'll tell you who I have 5 and 6 to round out my tier 2, because I'm curious where they fall into your tiers. But I have Jalen Johnson at 5 and Scotty Barnes at 6.
I had Scotty at 5 and Jalen at 6. So we're in the same vein there. I personally like Jalen's game more. I just think there's something. This is why Scotty didn't crack that first tier to me. I'm sure it's crazy it shouldn't be crazy to people who know that I hate the Raptors, but I'm sure some people would look at our lists and say, well, Scotty is the only one on there that made an all-star game. Why the hell is he in tier 2? And for me, the question, on top of the fact that he's had an injury-shortened season, so I'm sure there's some recency bias that is creeping in there. I think the other thing that I don't necessarily like, he has the atypical skills, right? He has a big man who can create capably in pick and roll situations. But what I don't necessarily like about him in the way that I would a conventional offense initiator is, one, he's doing it in an environment where the team results are terrible. I'm curious at how it would work in a situation where they have to play, competitive winning basketball. Is this a guy that you really want to trust in that role? Can he do it? Yes. Is he the type of guy that you would want to build a team around doing that? That I don't know. And I think part of it is because while I fully trust him, to get out, to run, to get downhill, to spray it out, those type of things, in conventional pick and roll settings, I still am not 100% there when it comes to, when guys go under on you and you have to rise up and hit shots. I think it's come along. I think he's made progress there, but I don't think he's on the level of the other guys in this draft class who we look at as guys who are initiating, which primarily in this case, I'm mostly just talking about Cade Cunningham there. I don't think that Scotty Barnes I think he's good at a lot of things. I don't know if I look at him with elite potential in anything. He's a very good defender. He's a very good creator from the, big wing position. Those are all great things, but I don't think his shooting is ridiculous. I think he's a lower ceiling defensively than guys like Mobley. I think he's more of your, generate steals, but not necessarily be as impactful as a guy like a Mobley. Jalen Johnson, to me, is the type of efficient, can excel around another, he can be a moon in orbit around the sun type of player in a way that I think Barnes isn't as acclimated to do so. So I gave Scotty a slight bump just because I think he possesses some unconventional skills. But in terms of the type of player I actually like, Jalen Johnson is much more that. I think he's fluid. I think he can do it. I think he is underrated as a passer is one thing. I mean, we talk about Şengün, but Jalen Johnson is 5 assists a game this season.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where we've seen wrinkles with Atlanta having so many big wings, the inverted pick and rolls with Trey, stuff like that we see deployed with Evan. I think you can see deployed to just, slightly less. I won't even say efficiency because Jalen's an efficient player. I think you look at him, though, and you see a lot of the same things that we've seen Evan add to his game. And really the main thing that separates the two is Evan is just a dominant defensive player in a way that Jalen isn't. But offensively, I think the guy has all the tools, and he's, the three-point shot is reasonably good. I think it can come along even further. At least I like the form. The numbers aren't going to blow you away, but Scotty and Jalen were right there for me. We just had them flipped.
The reason I had Scotty Barnes is a better player than Jalen Johnson today, assuming health. But when we were doing the redraft, I'm going off where I think their ceiling is. I almost put Jalen Johnson above Şengün and Franz. That's how much I like Jalen Johnson, but I couldn't get there just yet. That's why I had him at 5. The way I separated him and Scotty was I asked myself, crunch time, 1 possession, half court set, shot clock's running down. Who would I rather have the ball in their hands, Scotty or Jalen Johnson? And I kept finding myself preferring the ball in Jalen Johnson's hands as opposed to Scotty, which is why I gave him the ever so slight edge at 5 versus 6.
Okay, so I had 3 other guys in my
Tell me who they are. I'll tell you if they're in my tier 3.
Okay. I mean, even as I'm saying these guys, there's only one that I think potentially could jump into that Barnes Johnson mold, but I put them in the same tier, so I'm not happy with myself. Okay, but the 3 guys are Trey Murphy III.
I got him.
Jonathan Kuminga.
Got him.
And Jalen Suggs.
Got him.
Okay, so those 3 guys for me, I put them in this order. Well, my order was Trey Murphy III, Jalen Suggs, Jonathan Kuminga. I think I'll say this about these guys. One thing is I think Trey Murphy III, he's sort of in a similar situation to Evan in the sense of his development has been stunted slightly by the people that are around him. Because I think everybody sees the skill profile, the size, he's capable defensively. He's a very high volume 3-point shooter. He's been very good recently, albeit in a situation that's just terrible. Injury riddled. New Orleans is one of those teams. Herb Jones has taken it on the chin in this redraft because a guy who was everybody loved him last season. It's been a rough season in terms of all the analytics and the stats and things like that. But I think he's one of those. We'll get to him later. But
he's coming up, I promise.
Yes, he's coming up. But Trey Murphy III for me, I put him above Suggs and Kuminga because I just believe in the upside. And I made this case in the summer, and so far I don't know that it's proving out to look very good for me. But I liked his extension more than I liked Jalen Suggs' extension, despite the fact that Suggs re-signed this summer 5 for $150, and it's a de-escalating contract. So an average annual value of about $30 million. Trey Murphy came in for less money than that. And personally, you talked about how you've maybe given a bump to guys who are these big wings. That for me is the reason why I like Trey Murphy more, because I think what he provides is in shorter supply in the NBA. And while I love the intangibles of a Jalen Suggs, I'm never going to not want a guy who defends his ass off on my team. I think he's a guy who can put his offense secondary to, more focal point players while still being capable when called upon. I think those things are all great. I just think it's easier to find what Jalen Suggs is good at in this league in a way where I would prefer Trey Murphy the third, because I think that combination of 6'8", 6'9" guy who's a capable defender who can knock down 3-pointers at a super high volume is something that I find super intriguing. The reason I wouldn't move him up into a Jalen and Barnes situation is because I think he's a player who needs talent around him to really maximize him. He's not the guy who's just going to put the ball on the floor and drive through people all the time. Kuminga, I think, has more of that in him. I think he has more of that, high free throw rate, foul generator, get to your own shots, even if they're not the shots you want him to get to type of player. I think he's been stunted a bit being in Golden State, but I think one of the things that speaks to his effectiveness is, I was looking this up. In games that he's played 28 minutes or more, he's doing something like 22, 6, and 4. Which
he's productive.
Definitely very productive. I don't know. I think he butts heads at times with Kerr because he doesn't necessarily make the play that he wants him to within the framework of the offense. but I think that's kind of stunted his development because Kerr has a notoriously short leash when it comes to both those guys, Kuminga and Moody. And Kuminga, I also think, the fact that he's going into this summer without a deal speaks to the reasons why maybe he hasn't achieved what he could, but I still believe in him when I see him out there because there's just something about a certain level of aggression a guy brings. And I think Franz has it, which is why I can overlook some of the shortcomings of his shot because I think he knows when to attack, and I don't think he's hesitant to do it. I think Kuminga has those same things. So that was my order.
So I had 3 of those guys in my tier 3 along with one other. I'll give you the order. I actually had Suggs ever so slightly ahead of Murphy just because I saw when Paolo went out, the offensive load that then went on to Jalen Suggs, and he was not just capable of doing it, but showed me more of his offensive game than I ever thought was imaginable at this point. And I would argue he's the best point of attack defender in all of basketball. He's a pain in the ass to deal with when he's fighting over screens. I understand Murphy with the big wing. He's in less competition in that particular area just because there's so few guys at his size that can shoot like he can. But I need to see more from a creation standpoint for Murphy to bump him over Suggs, who we just saw before this. Hopefully, do we ever get clarity on what the injury was?
Well, they said back spasms. They didn't say, what it was. They just said that they thought that despite his reaction being like heinous looking and the cringing on
he's
the court,
gonna be all right.
that he should be all right.
Okay.
Yeah. I got the impression from what I saw in the aftermath of that game that they weren't expecting it to be some super long-term thing. But it was muscles seizing up, and it's just one of those situations where in the moment, there's nothing you can do about it.
So I would have Suggs just slightly ahead. I actually had Jalen Green ahead of Kuminga, and this is the potential. I don't exactly know what to do with this, and I see you smirking because I could tell you have some Jalen Green thoughts, and no one's matter about the 2021 draft and the Houston Rockets, who Jalen Green's not a bad player. Is he a winning player? I have no idea. And I have the same questions about Kuminga, but I've seen some stuff from Jalen Green that entice me. The talent's tantalizing, but I mean, like,
he's a great athlete. I mean, he had that run at the end of last season. Admittedly, it was in the absence of a lot of their star players. Fantastic for that run where they were pushing for that final play-in spot, and he was great in that stretch.
Yeah. So I have him in there, him and Kuminga. Once again, if he wanted to flip them, I'm okay flipping them. The talent is there. Is it the right fit to maximize it? No. Am I willing to sell all my stock? Not necessarily, but I had that in the tier 3 of, I don't think they could be your best or your second best player. At the end of the day, could they turn into your third best guy? Maybe. And that's why I had them all in tier 3.
Okay. Well, I bumped Green into my tier 3. So all those guys I gave you before, Scotty, Jalen, Trey, Jalen Suggs, and Kuminga, I had put them in tier 2. Although I do feel like there is a gap between Jalen Johnson and Trey Murphy III. I think that would have been fair for me to separate those. But since I put those 5 in my tier 2, my tier 3, Jalen slipped into tier 3 for me, as did Cam Thomas, because I think I share a lot of the same concerns you alluded to, which is they're clearly unbelievable scores at times. Cam specifically is we've played him. He's very difficult to stop. He can get to the line. He can create offense, and he's relatively efficient in terms of his scoring. It's just, I don't know within a team framework if I truly believe in that. And if I penalize Jalen in a way that I didn't Kuminga, it's because we do have a bigger sample of Jalen. And I think he's gotten the type of run that Kuminga necessarily hasn't. So I'm still holding on to hope that Kuminga can pull it together in a way that I think Jalen is essentially what he is and what we've seen, which is the guy can score. I just don't know if that compensates for all the other areas in a way where I would put him on the same tier. But I think Jalen and Cam are in that tier 3 for me, alongside 3 guys who play nothing like them. And those guys for me, one of them we alluded to before, Herb Jones.
Yep.
Santi Aldama is another guy who, that's a player I really like. And here's the reason. I think people underestimate, one, he's a big who can shoot from 3. Yep. I think that's a very difficult thing to find. Second, I think he's just been very impactful towards winning. One of the things that I think is interesting, this is a stat that I think it speaks somewhat to team success. So you got to take this with a grain of salt, because guys tend to skew towards the top of this if they are also on very good teams. But I was looking at the player impact estimate for all the guys in the 2021 draft class. Now, if I was to ask you, who do you think tops that stat for this season? I think most of us would say, well, it's got to be Mobley, right? We're 31-4.
I would be shocked if it's not, but the way you're asking the question means there's no way it's Evan Mobley, and it's probably your guy here.
No. Okay, close though. Evan Mobley is third this season. He has a 15.2 in the player impact estimate. A 16.8 right above him is Alperen Şengün. And I think, that makes sense.
Checks out.
He's a very good team, and he has the ball in his hands a ton. This is going to be impacted by things like counting stats, but that's what makes Aldama's so impressive to me. Number one is Franz Wagner, who, we don't think of him in the same caliber this year because it's such a shortened sample. But this sample, all they're going to go off of is what the counting stats were and what the performance was when he was on the court. So even though he's played significantly less games, he has a player impact estimate of 17. Then you have Şengün second. You have Mobley third. Beating out number 5, who's Cade Cunningham, is Santi Aldama in this metric. And
Santi.
And admittedly, it's not that this is some be-all, end-all, but consider this. Evan Mobley is a true shooting percentage of 65% this year. He's the only other guy in the top 10 shooting above 60% true shooting percentage. He's nearly 39% from three-point range. He's over 50% from the floor. So he is a very good shooter. It's just the workload upon him isn't that much. But when you think about it, even the counting stats, 13 and 7 is pretty respectable for
absolutely
in the framework of that offense, playing behind, big usage guys, Jaren Jackson Jr., John Morant. So I find his situation very intriguing in the sense that he's also one of these guys that hasn't even got paid yet. And one of the things I thought I should look at when we were doing this thing is just kind of what guys are making relative to our perceptions of them and where he falls in this whole thing. I'm curious to see what his contract's going to be because most of the guys in this category for me, Herb Jones has been paid. He's on what most people consider one of the biggest values in basketball. He makes roughly $13.5 million a season over 4 years. But the next few guys I gave you, Jalen Green got in that protracted negotiation that ultimately settled on a 2-1, which is almost unheard of, especially for a second overall pick.
Yeah.
Where he's making roughly $35 million. Cam Thomas obviously wants to be paid, but he's playing for a team that's trying to decide what direction they're going. They're selling off parts. And then you have Aldama. I will be watching this summer intently just to see the type of value that a Memphis places on him, because I do think he fills a role that a lot of teams are lacking. And I'm a big fan of his game. So for me, my tier 3 was Herb, Cam, Jalen, Santi Aldama, and the last guy was Giddey, who I don't particularly love as a prospect, but I can acknowledge, again, he possesses many of those unconventional tools that he gets knocked a lot because I don't necessarily think his offense holds up in a way that you would need it to compensate for the fact that he's a big guard who can do a little scoring, who can get downhill, who can pass, who can rebound. I don't love his shot. I don't love his free throw shooting, and I don't necessarily trust him to finish games sometimes, which I think is a pretty damning criticism of anybody when you're trying to decide how much you want to pay him. But that was my tier 3. I'm curious where you fall on those guys and then your tiering.
So Aldama, Giddey, Cam Thomas, Herb Jones, and Ayo Dosunmu, the guard from Chicago, I had in my next tier of I like certain aspects of their game. I have no idea how to sort these out. On any given day, I could think one of them is technically 11 on this list and the other is 15. And you could ask me the next day, and maybe Cam Thomas scored 48 on the Clippers. And I'm like, oh, it's definitely Cam Thomas. And he follows it up with a stinker. Herb Jones finally snaps out of his shooting slump. They're all in the same contingent. You made an incredible case for Aldama. I didn't realize he was at 13 and 7 this year, and his shooting. He was a guy I would have loved the Cavs to make a run at last year at the deadline.
Yeah, I feel like he and Fontecchio both kind of were those guys that I'm like, well, maybe.
Yeah, and because they fit well, they're low usage guys. They don't need the rock, but they seem to be impactful every time they're on the court. So maybe he should be in a class of his own, as he's probably a little ahead of those. But Giddey, I love Cam Thomas. Like, my dad's a Nets fan. I grew up in New Jersey. I grew up a Nets fan. Cam Thomas has single-handedly made watching some Nets games this year palatable when everything else on the court is completely apparent.
So you see a parallel there with like the Colin Sexton syndrome a little bit, because in some way it feels similar to me. It feels like you can't question his numbers. He's doing 25, 4, and 3
as the only offensive option when teams know he's going to shoot every time he catches it. And his shot making is incredible, but I'm not sure how many people have actually sat down and watched a Nets game this year. And I would not recommend it unless you have anything better to do. If your dog needs to be walked, that is a better option than watching a Nets basketball game this year, unless they're playing the Cavs. But he hits the difficulty And the level of difficulty consistently on the shots he makes is absurd. The dude can score. I just don't know if he has any place on a team that needs something or frankly anything else from a guy other than jacking shots. So he's in the grab bag of I like them. And Herb Jones is the complete opposite, right? Like Herb Jones does all the little things you want, and it's the simple ability just to score that you're like, I would love to be just a little bit better. You combine Cam Thomas and Herb Jones, we're talking about the greatest player in the history of the world.
Yeah.
But they split up, and it's like Venom, and you got one of each. So they're in the same grouping, which gives me my top 14. I'll give you in order real quick. This is my top 15, actually.
Okay.
I went Cunningham over Mobley. It's purely positional. I'll always lean to the big wing over the big. And in Cunningham's count, it's a big point guard, a supersized point guard. But we're, once again, splitting hairs. I had Franz 3, Şengün 4, Jalen Johnson 5, Scotty Barnes 6, Jalen Suggs 7, Trey Murphy 8, Jalen Green 9, Kuminga 10. I'm gonna give you the Aldama at 11. You convinced me to put Aldama at 11. And then these next 4 could literally be in any order. But Giddey, Cam Thomas, Herb Jones, and Ayo Dosunmu were my top 15 in the draft, with honorable mentions to Quentin Grimes and Corey Kispert for at least deserve a name recognition here.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you who my honorable mentions were. I'll give you my list. I'll count it down. Cade, Evan, Şengün, Wagner, Barnes, Jalen Johnson, Trey Murphy III, Jalen Suggs, Jonathan Kuminga, Herb Jones, Santi Aldama, Cam Thomas, Jalen Green, Josh Giddey. My honorable mentions were Ayo Dosunmu, Trey Mann, and Quentin Grimes. Quentin Grimes, I know we saw him kind of go off against us, but I think people sleep on Trey and Quentin a little bit. Trey hasn't played many games this year. He's only played 13 games, but he was fantastic in those 13 games. And Quentin's one of those guys who, shockingly, I mean, he's shooting above 40% from 3. He's shooting nearly 50% from the floor. I think it's just an awkward fit in Dallas because he's a guy who, solid defender, positive defender, but sometimes looks better with the ball in his hands, and that's not a situation that's going to exist much in Dallas. So I think we got the perfect game to watch Quentin Grimes, but he's certainly somebody that I find interesting. Now, I'm not going to dive into the whole bottom end of this draft, but what I did want to do before we got out of here was just one other way I wanted to look at this was through the prism of contracts, because we talk about these guys independent of the deals they're on. But since we know what some of the guys are making, I thought it would be interesting to say, would that feeling on the situation at all? Because most of these guys signed. We have a bunch of guys who signed the max contract. Cade signed the 5 for $224. You had Mobley 5 for $224. You have Barnes 5 for $224. Wagner 5 for $224. But then you get into some of these other guys that we mentioned, and you start to find some value deals. We alluded to Herb, who makes $13.5 million, 4 years, $54 million. Jalen Green signed that 2-1, a player option on the final year, and he's making an average of just over $35 million. Then you have Şengün. This is where things get a little bit interesting. Yeah. So Jalen Johnson signed a 5 for $150, which is equivalent to what Jalen Suggs signed. Those guys both cost $30 million a year. In this new CBA environment, the difference between an average annual value of $44 million a year and $30 million a year is a substantial player, is a substantial piece in your rotation. So the idea that Şengün...
Hey, Bob, real quick, was Jalen Johnson 3 for 150 or 5 for 150? I think it was 3 for 150.
Well, he couldn't have signed a 3 for 150. I mean, that would be above the standard.
I'm looking at NBA.com right now. That's why I'm confused. That's what I had pulled up. Jalen Johnson.
You know what? You might be right. Maybe I boned that. Let me I'll edit this part.
No, NBA.com has it wrong on their thing. It was 5 years, 150. You're right.
Okay. Yeah. So
you were right. NBA. And I will drop the link in the chat so people know I'm not crazy. But NBA.com, players who signed rookie extensions before 2024 deadline has this wrong. So bad job by you, NBA.com.
Well, so you got Jalen and you've got Suggs making $30 million a year. If I considered contracts, what I would say is I would immediately put Jalen Johnson probably definitely above Barnes and maybe even above Wagner. I'm curious if anything would change in your view, knowing what we know about the few deviations from the rookie max that we get in that top 10. Would you bet on a guy? That's the other thing. The other thing to mention is in our top 10, Kuminga does not have a deal yet. He essentially bet on himself. So he's going to hit restricted free agency next summer. And I imagine the Warriors are either going to sign and trade him or leverage him into a deal that is not the 5 for $224 million. So essentially what I'm asking you, McNuggets, is knowing what we know about their second deals, would that change your ordering if you're considering their financial impact at all?
Yeah, I like Jalen Johnson at 30 over Franz for 45, ever so slightly. Trey Murphy at 20. That feels like just a bargain. Like, Franz is a better player than Trey Murphy. I am not, we already talked about, we're not going to argue that, but Trey Murphy plus what you could sign for $16 million, is that better than Franz by itself?
It's tough. I think it's debatable. I think you can make the argument.
And I don't like, if we were redrafting with contracts, right? Mobley and Cunningham, to me, non-negotiable. They're the two best players. Their contracts do not matter. If they were max, if they were even more, I'm not changing my opinion on that. After that, if you're starting a bargain hunt, Johnson might be the third pick there. Jalen Johnson may be the third guy of contract. I know you're a little higher in Şengün than I was, and at 37 with the player option, that is certainly a great bargain value for the Houston Rockets. But I think Jalen Johnson has a chance to be special. And $30 million in today's day and age is an incredible. I mean, we talked about Jared Allen's extension.
I mean, look at what OG Anunoby got. He just got like $42 million average annual value.
And I'm taking Jalen Johnson today over that. So I think Jalen Johnson's the big riser here, and Trey Murphy at 28. I know he doesn't do a ton of creation himself. He needs to be set up, but I love that number for him. I think those two go a little higher. But for the most part, the best players have gotten paid what they deserve. And Jalen Green is the one who hasn't maxed out that contract yet, but he's on the 2-for-1, which, to be honest with you, is a great deal for the Rockets. And if he plays well, he's going to get that giant deal.
I prefer, if I'm the Rockets, given that they have all that young, player development in the works. I mean, they're not even playing Reed Shepherd this year. So I wouldn't mind at least the ability to be like, okay, we're not committed to a 5-year max with no out. It's a player out on the third year. But if there's a situation where, Jalen is not getting what he considers appropriate touches, minutes, etc., then you might just by default free up availability for guys that you want to commit those resources to.
Also looking at Herb Jones here, and that's another one. He's not skyrocketing into the top 5, but Herb for 13.5, that is a top 10 pick, solidifying him as one of the 10 best values in this draft, even if he's not on either of our lists, one of the 10 best players.
Well, and I think that's what's interesting about this situation that we're looking at with Aldama, Cam Thomas, Giddey, is that typically restricted free agency allows you to kind of leverage guys. And we've talked a bit on this podcast about how few teams have cap space. You're looking at Brooklyn and Washington, and how much will they even have to commit to those guys? Because if you look at the price range, if you based it on where we tiered these guys, the values are shifting down from, 45 million average annual value at the top end into the guys in our second tier are making a much closer to $30 million a year. And then we're saying that we view Cam Thomas and maybe Jalen Green in that range or below there. So I'll be curious to see where those guys settle. But I think I come ultimately to the same conclusion as you do, which is when I look at these deals, I think Jalen Johnson and Trey Murphy III get a significant bump when you consider their value relative to that of guys making roughly 150% of them in Scotty Barnes and Franz Wagner. I still would keep Şengün because he didn't take a full max. I mean, he's making 37 as average annual value. I think that would keep him in the third spot for me, but I think Jalen would vault up to number 4 if I'm considering future contractual impact.
That's a hell of a Şengün at 37. That's a hell of a deal for Houston.
Yeah.
And you know what's crazy too is it's still 37 a year over 5 years. Like, I understand if I was an NBA player in a position to sign a rookie max, give me every dollar possible. I am not. This is not. You get every dollar you could possibly make. Every dollar you can make, go make it. But what's the difference in 185 versus like 200 if you could sign someone else to help you win? And I'm not saying it Mobley or Cunningham or Wagner, anyone who signed the full max wants to win any less than Şengün by any. I'm not saying that. But God, it is nice to have that little extra flexibility to use around the margins here, Bob, if a player is willing to take that. That's all I'm saying.
And to speak to Houston, I mean, they poured a bunch of money into what could essentially be a placeholder in Fred VanVleet. So he's making maybe more than you would want to give a guy at his point in his career trajectory, but they have an option to get out of that even. So that's a contract in excess of $40 million. So the Rockets are definitely a team. I mean, for all the conversation we have about the Cavs and the Thunder, In the present, I don't think the separation is as vast. I think as we go on, though, that's when it becomes even scarier, is because if you ask me today, do I think that the Cavaliers are a tier below the Thunder? I don't think so. I think that we should be talked about in the same tier as the Celtics and the Thunder, but the Thunder still have considerable avenues to get even better with many, many cost-controlled assets. So I will be super curious to see how these next few years grow a hatred within me from a place of envy and jealousy that I didn't know I possessed.
They showed the graphic during the Knicks-Thunder game that the Oklahoma City front office has acquired the roster they have, the cap sheet they have, and they have a dozen draft picks in the first round of the next 4 drafts. And I would like to hate on it, but Sam Presti is an Emerson College basketball alum just like myself. So I have to support Sam Presti and give him kudos for accumulating that kind of draft. They have 4 first-round picks this year. 4.
Potentially, yeah. I mean,
there are stipulations on some of them, but you look at that roster, if they ever decide to cash their chips in, no team's going to make a better offer than Oklahoma City can with the young talent they have, the contracts they have, plus the plethora of draft picks. And at some point, you assume or you would think that they will cash it in for something. But when you're also 30-5, with the young guys playing at the level they are, with Chet Holmgren still coming back from injury, I'm not breaking that up till I know I have to, or a Giannis-type player becomes available. And that's pretty scary down the road here, Bob.
Well, that's something that I thought was interesting, too, is when we talked about this 2021 draft, there was a guy late in the second round, Aaron Wiggins, who Oklahoma City
great fourth quarter against the Knicks the other day.
Yeah, and he's already got paid. They locked him up for $9 million a year over 5 years. Now, when you look at the guys around him in the draft, that's sort of an outlier on the high end. And I think you can look at what Oklahoma City's doing with, re-signing Caruso and Wiggins. Having all those picks is a luxury because it also gives you more escape outlets if you make some financial blunders.
Yep.
So I look at a guy like Wiggins, and maybe $9 million was an overpay compared to what he could actually command on the outside market, but the ability to be able to use some of that excess draft capital. Because we remember when Boston had multiple picks, they had to keep kicking the can back because it's hard to say, I'm going to bring in 3 first-round picks who are going to take up guaranteed roster spots. I think that's the other part that's super interesting is beyond just the idea of who may they draft, I think it gives them the ability to make a lot more mistakes when it comes to contracts and still be able to reposition themselves in the future financially, something that we or the Knicks don't necessarily possess, something that Boston has long since abandoned.
I think even more than that, what makes the pick so enticing is, let's say they love a guy in the draft and they're picking at, let's just arbitrarily say they have the 8th pick is their highest pick of the 4, but they love someone at 3. They can go up and get that guy. Like, they can make a Godfather offer. I mean, according to reports, they tried to make a Godfather offer to the Cavs for Evan Mobley, and Kobe Altman rightfully said, thank you, but no thank you. There's no amount of draft picks that will allow us to surpass this.
It's very hard because if you're on the other side of that, even a terrible team, even the Nets, what are the chances that 4 first-round draft picks you use, even if you got 3 later picks that were 10 and beyond, the dramatic drop-off in value, a lot of times, you really have to have a good scouting department. Mm-hmm. You have to have people who can identify misses because we talked about it in this draft, just the idea that no man's land. You made it to Şengün at 16, but basically everyone from 9 on was a prospect that wasn't anywhere close to his ilk. So there was a ton of misses in there. It's always such a gamble to consolidate. When you think about it, even the Jalen Johnson one, the Knicks could have taken Jalen Johnson. That was the Kai Jones pick, and they traded that and all that with Charlotte. But the idea that you could have landed a guy that late in the draft, it's just so hard. That's what makes me so appreciative of being relatively successful when it comes to who we've identified. People quibble about Okoro, but when you look at the returns on guys with fairly limited samples, very limited college sample from Darius Garland, and that turned out magnificently. Mobley, we're discussing him as a top 2 prospect. He was taken 3rd. I don't see how you can't possibly see that as a win. So
especially when the first guy went 1, he was the best guy after the first guy was off the board.
Exactly. So, looking back at this draft, I feel validated. I'm glad we did this exercise today. And I know it took longer probably than anybody was expecting. But for all listeners, thank you for indulging. It's not often that I hadn't got a chance to talk to Mike, and I wanted to make it something more than just reacting to any individual game.
It was fun. And it was a hell of a draft. Turns out there's a lot of good players over 60 picks. It's just a matter of, can you identify the ones that are the right guys? And if you don't, you probably don't have a job very long, because there are a few, especially Golden State, who had 2 lottery picks in that draft, who neither has been a true unquestioned hit. And if you look at that, I mean, they passed on LaMelo for James Wiseman.
Just
2
think,
years later.
what if Kuminga was Franz? I mean, you're looking at a similar archetype, a big forward who they expected to be able to ball handle a little bit. My best man he's pretty defeated right now with the state of the Warriors. But we talk about that draft all the time. Moody was one of those guys I think everybody liked because he had atypical size in the backcourt. So he was happy when he fell to him. But that spot, that Kuminga-Franz decision there, it was a tough one. And I think you look at what Franz did, and obviously you probably don't feel great about it. But by the same token, I'm curious what kind of run and leash he would have got in a Kerr system. Because I think that's got to be probably one of those things in Golden State that would be frustrating to me, is watching a team on its last legs just botch what it's doing with its young talent. Nobody should feel good about this upcoming summer. I think they can leverage Kuminga, and in some ways, I do think it will work out if they want to retain Kuminga, but the whole concept of not extending him only works out if you want him back. And there's times where I look at Golden State and I think this is a marriage headed for a divorce, regardless of what his final price tag comes to.
Yeah, my last point on all this, Bob, is fit matters. And the situation you're drafted in is often more important than the actual slot you're picked in. And you could go to Şengün as the perfect example.
Goes to years of injury, and now he looks like he's on the other side of it. Yeah,
exactly. So fit is a huge component of this. And are you going to an organization that's willing to be patient and put you in the right positions to succeed? Are they going to throw you to the wolves and pray it works out? And luckily for the Cavs, more often than not, they have not always hit home runs, but they have not had these complete misses where you get nothing in return for a high pick.
Okay, Mike, we'll end on this note. Prediction for Wednesday. What do you think the outcome is?
My gut tells me I should pick against the Cavs, but I can't do that. I can't. They're 31-4. I'm going to go with a classic. And I mean one of the games that we'll talk about in 5 years from now. Bob will come on and do a rewatchables of this Wednesday night, January 8th, Cavs Thunder game. I think it plays more into the Oklahoma City style than it does the Cavs style. But the Cavs are going to turn up defensively in a way we haven't seen this season and win this game 98-96 on a last-second stop. The defense for the Cavs, the difference in this one.
Okay. And since I don't want to just say the same thing as you, I'm going to say that we blow the doors off of them. You know, I don't necessarily believe that. But if it happens, I'll insist that I knew that was going to be the whole time. I'm predicting a win by at least 8 to 10 points. And I think our offense will have I think we will score more against them than they allow this season. How about that? That's all I'll really commit to, because I'm not a man of bold predictions. I'm a man of waiting till the outcome plays out and then insisting that I knew that was going to be. So if you don't follow Mike already on Twitter, it's at Mike Lucas TV, and on YouTube, it's the Ultimate Cleveland Sports Show. Mike, thank you for taking so much time today, to join the podcast. I'm glad that we finally made it happen, and it was an honor to have you give me so much of your time.
Anytime, Bob. It was a blast, and I'm glad we could officially start the Send Darius to San Francisco or We Riot campaign here on the Fear the Fro pod.
Well, you're goddamn right. So 5-star review, guys. If you like it, subscribe, please follow on the platforms. Do the same for the Ultimate Cleveland Sports Show, although I probably don't even need to be telling you that. I'm sure you already are. So thanks again. Till the next time, post Oklahoma City victory on the Fear the Fro podcast.